give a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
And you're still at Butte College, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's right.
And
That
we're
is
live.
right.
All right, excellent. Well, good evening, everyone, if you're on the East Coast, and good afternoon if you're not. This is Tracy McIntyre. I am the lead educator for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I am joined by my colleague, Melissa. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Melissa Wynn. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine.
Excellent. And we are very happy today to welcome everyone to our Meet the Author event. And we are going to be talking to Dillon Carroll. Dillon is a history instructor at Butte College in Oroville, California. He holds a doctorate in history from the University of Georgia. And we are going to be discussing his book, Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness and Civil War Soldiers. He's going to be giving a brief presentation, and then we will open it up for questions. So Dillon, I will hand it over to you.
Okie dokie. Thanks very much for having me. This is my third or fourth time talking to the museum. A couple times in person, a couple times online. So it's always a joy.
Great. I'm glad to have you back.
Yeah. All right. Let me get this saddled up and ready to roll. Okay. So welcome everyone. I hope you're watching this and then you're going to go watch the final championship or the final four or something. So thanks for joining. Go Cougs. And so this is going to be a short presentation from my 2021 book, Invisible Wounds. Little shameless self-promotion here. And it's not going to be sort of a summary of the book. Instead, I'm just going to emphasize some of the medical aspects since I am talking to the medical museum after all. And so in this case, I'm going to talk about the medical aspects of mental illness and if Civil War soldiers may have struggled with something like PTSD and what doctors at the time thought about mental illness and those they were seeing among soldiers and veterans, and then how some of that medical thought about mental illness began to change in part because of the Civil War. So really quickly, we should first maybe define what is PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a constellation of symptoms that has grown since it was first published in the DSM-3 in 1980. But essentially, I think it's worth imagining PTSD as three separate sets of symptoms. The first is hypervigilance and hyperarousal. So the brain is hardwired to alert us to danger and potential trauma. The amygdala, the guard dog of the brain of sorts, when it perceives danger, initiates a complex series of chemical events to initiate the fight or flight response. And PTSD kind of hijacks these responses. And the brain, with those afflicted with PTSD, begins to see danger in ordinary situations. So people with PTSD from war or a natural disaster, for instance, might be scanning the tops of buildings for snipers at farmers markets or seeing potential IEDs on trash day. And many begin to avoid situations like this, like busy public situations, for fear of triggering their arousal or hypervigilance. The second set of symptoms from PTSD is emotional numbing. Those afflicted with PTSD often feel dead to the world, suffering with depression or strange, unfeeling reactions. Sometimes they feel like it's hard to have emotions. They feel emotionally dead to the people around them. And finally, and the signature symptom of PTSD is invasive nightmares, flashbacks, and hallucinations. So those with PTSD suffer from unwanted and intrusive nightmares, flashbacks, and hallucinations of the terrifying event that they survived. And this is the signature symptom of PTSD, what separates it from other mental disorders. Most of us experience time as linear. Um, those with PTSD have their experience of time kind of hijacked, and it becomes circular. They keep coming back to this event that they survived and that traumatized them in these nightmares, flashbacks, and hallucinations. Um, PTSD, it wasn't always constant. There's a history to this disorder. And I think it's worth kind of thinking about the history of PTSD. It's not been around forever. And in fact, it was arguably born in the 1980s with Sigmund Freud. Um, Freud, then with the collaborator Joseph Breuer, conceived of the traumatic memory. And this idea that traumatic memory would be the bedrock of PTSD, the foundation of PTSD. Working with traumatized patients, Freud and Breuer eerily described nightmares and flashbacks that are remarkably similar to modern day manifestations of PTSD. For instance, in their 1892 work on this, they wrote, quote, "In regard to traumatic hysteria, it is obviously the accident which has evoked the syndrome. And when we learn from the utterances of patients in hysterical attacks that they invariably hallucinate in every attack a repetition of the original occurrence, which evoked the first, the casual connection then also becomes perfectly clear here." And this is really a remarkable description of invasive nightmares, flashbacks, or hallucinations of a traumatic event. Freud would eventually abandon this work, but he would return to it after the First World War because scores of World War II veterans came home from the conflict emotionally and psychologically damaged. Because so many fought, 10 million would die, an inconceivable number in 1914. The sheer numbers of emotionally and psychologically damaged veterans was impossible to ignore. And the most well-known medical term then was shell shock. It was not the only term to describe it. There were several others to describe mental illness among soldiers and veterans, but shell shock was kind of the most well-known that even lives on. My students know shell shock today. There was a lively professional debate among psychiatrists in the 1920s and 30s about mental illness and shell shock and what was causing it. Virtually no one from the public paid attention to any of these psychiatric debates that were taking place in journals and within the walls of the ivory tower. But many World War I veterans noted that something had changed in them. And they noted also, many of them, like Robert Graves, that they experienced these unwanted nightmares, flashbacks, and hallucinations. Graves wrote, quote, "I was still mentally and nervously organized for war. Shells used to come bursting on my bed at midnight, even though Nancy shared it with me. Strangers in the daytime would assume the faces of friends who had been killed." Um, World War II is perhaps the least well known in this history of trauma and war because it's kind of shrouded in secrecy. The soldiers in America who fought in the war came from a generation that didn't have patience for complaining about personal problems. And so those who came back from the war were silent about the war's emotional and psychological effects. The writer Carl Shapiro called it the, quote, "generation of silence." But we do know that soldiers were psychologically and emotionally harmed by the war. The term of psychological and emotional trauma from World War II was combat exhaustion. And we do know that a number of soldiers were discharged due to psychiatric reasons, and nearly 250,000 American soldiers were discharged during World War II for psychiatric reasons. That constituted amazingly 43% of all medical discharges. So it was a serious problem. After the war, Eisenhower would commission a report about trauma and combat in World War II, that concluded with shocking results. A part of it reads, quote, "There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Psychiatry casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare." Um, but the conflict which really brought PTSD into, with really, birthed it, was Vietnam. Vietnam, when it came to PTSD, would be a transformative conflict. Numerous veterans came home with a vaguely understood, loosely defined condition called, quote, Vietnam syndrome. And a small group of disaffected veterans and psychiatrists believed that this was a legitimate condition, and they lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to add it to the DSM, the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual, which is kind of the Bible of psychiatrists. After nearly a decade of lobbying, the American Psychiatric Association added PTSD to the DSM-3 in 1980, and PTSD was born. Did Civil War soldiers suffer with PTSD? We don't know for sure, but many of them seem to have suffered with something at least like it. Um, Soldiers during the war sometimes wrote about it in letters and diaries in ways that are eerily similar to descriptions of post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, the signature symptom of PTSD is unwanted nightmares, flashbacks, and hallucinations. One such soldier pictured here was James Williams, who joined the 28th Alabama Infantry. Williams fought in the bloody Battle of Shiloh in Western Tennessee. And after the conflict, he wrote that, quote, "The terrible scenes of the 2 days are indelibly fixed in my memory," suggesting they're kind of burned in his memory. And several days later, he wrote to his wife a remarkable passage, quote, "I've had great and exciting times at night with my dreams since the battle. Some of them are tragedies and frighten me more than ever the fight did when I was awake." When I first read this, when I was researching, I nearly fell out of my chair. It was so shocking. Uh, Another such soldier, a Union soldier, was John Jackson. I have not been able to find a picture of John Jackson. He fought in the 32nd Maine Infantry. This is the best I could come up with. Um, and Jackson took part in the Overland Campaign, Grant's brutal conflict to try and grind Lee's Army of Northern Virginia into dust. And for 6 weeks, Jackson, the 32nd Maine, and the Army of the Potomac fought in nearly continuous conflict. Um, Jackson, after the Battle of Cold Harbor, wrote, quote, "I look upon war as I never did before. I always knew it was a horrid thing, but each hour reveals new horrors." And later he wrote his father, quote, "After each battle, I feel for a few days pretty well played out, but my mind, I think, suffers more of the two than my body, even though I get very tired and feel almost exhausted." That was another passage that blew me away when I first read it. Um, Looking at veterans after the war is really interesting and fascinating, and the book devotes a chapter to Theodore Otis. And I thought I would just briefly talk about Otis because he represents the really complex and difficult and fascinating aspects of trying to sort through this and parse through this and understand if Civil War soldiers had mental illness related to the war. Otis was a Roxbury, Massachusetts native, born to an elite farming family. His father was wealthy, serving at one point as the mayor of Roxbury. In 1861, Otis volunteered with the 24th Massachusetts. He served a year and then was discharged. He re-enlisted with the 3rd Massachusetts Cavalry, eventually rising to second lieutenant. The unit served in the Gulf, occupying New Orleans, fighting at the Battle of Port Hudson, at the Battle of Jackson, and in the Red River Campaign. Um, like many Civil War soldiers, Jackson suffered with bouts of disease and illness. At one point, he wrote to his parents, quote, "The cause of my being sick was drinking the river water, which we had to at first, but now we have wells." He went on, oh, crud. Uh-oh. Oh, no, sorry. I don't know what happened there. And we're back. He later wrote to his parents, quote, "The diarrhea stuck to me, however, and I've about thrown that off. I've lost 15 pounds, weigh 142 pounds." And finally, he wrote in 1864, quote, "If this campaign lasts a couple of months longer, I leave to stand what I have had to for the last 2 months. I shall either be underground or go out of the army." Following the war, Otis returned to Roxbury, Massachusetts, and his father's household. He joined Augustus Caldwell in starting a florist business, which apparently was successful, in no small part to his father's wealthy father's support. This is the census from 1870, showing Theodore Otis listed as a florist. In 1872, he met and married Elizabeth Morton. And in 1874, the couple announced they would move to California, where Otis hoped to make his fortune. He returned to Massachusetts probably in 1878 with his tail between his legs, and upon his return, his family began to notice that something was wrong with Theodore. He struggled to find and keep work. He seemed listless and unaware of his financial predicament. And perhaps most disturbing for his family and friends in the society and culture they lived in, his emotions seemed to range out of his control. His mother-in-law remembered, quote, "He was very emotional, would break down while reading. He complained of pain in his head and he was listless at times." His brother-in-law recalled an incident when Otis visited him in New York City where, quote, "He was emotional, easily breaking into tears. The first night of his arrival, while at dinner and while in the presence of quite a large company of strangers, he broke into tears for some minutes at the mere mention of certain incidents of the late war." Around 1880, Otis moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, partnered with James McKee in a storage business. The 1880 census lists him living with the McKee family. The storage business failed for reasons that are unclear. McKee blamed Theodore and his erratic behavior and emotions. The Otis family accused McKee of being a shady character. In 1885, Theodore Otis applied and was accepted to the National Home for Disabled and Volunteer Soldiers, or what was known colloquially as the Soldiers' Home, which was a care facility for Civil War veterans. Here he is listed as his entry at the Soldiers' Home. His condition deteriorated so severely that by 86, they transferred him to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, an insane asylum in Washington, D.C., that in 1866, Congress charged with caring for mentally ill soldiers and veterans from the Civil War. Here is his entry in the St. Elizabeth's logbook, then called the Government Hospital for the Insane. His admittance form listed the cause of his mental illness as paresis, which is dementia sometimes caused by late-stage syphilis. Syphilis, if untreated, which at the time they couldn't treat it, its late stage would result in dementia-like symptoms. And certainly an unknown number of Civil War veterans with mental illness probably suffered with syphilis. The word probably reached the Otis family that their son Theodore had been diagnosed with dementia caused by syphilis, which was a terrible stain on the family, a scarlet letter of sorts. And so his parents probably launched a campaign to alter the diagnosis, which may explain why his hospital file at St. Elizabeth's Insane Asylum has numerous wartime letters where his parents have underlined his entries mentioning when he was sick or suffering from exposure, such as this one. And this campaign seems to have been successful. The asylum superintendent, William W. Godding, pictured here, assessed Otis for syphilis and decided he had not contracted the disease, and instead the wartime letters convinced Dr. Godding that Theodore Otis's mental illness was caused by disease and exposure, which was a standard diagnosis for the time. Godding wrote, quote, "Otis suffered from diarrhea and probably from malaria and from exposure to cold while in the service, and that the exhaustion caused by these diseases was probably the origin of the slowly developing disease of the brain. So it can be incredibly tricky to figure out if Civil War soldiers suffered with mental illness related to the war, such as something like post-traumatic stress disorder. So what did doctors think? A lot of the book looks at St. Elizabeth's Hospital from roughly 1861 to 1890. And during this period, it treated an estimated 2,700 white Union veterans who entered the walls of the asylum suffering with mental illness. Doctors there during the war, as they were struggling with waves of Civil War soldiers entering mentally ill, were quick to point out that the war was not a cause for the rise in mental illness that the hospital was experiencing. Dr. Charles Nichols, then the superintendent, wrote in 1864, quote, "It should not be inferred that the war has been a prolific moral cause of insanity, either among the men of the land and naval forces waging hostilities against the common enemy, or among civilians of either sex or of any class." And this was an attempt to demonstrate the patriotism, I think, of Civil War soldiers, that their service in the war was not driving them mentally ill, because then that might lead some to question the justness of the Union cause. Another physician from a different asylum said, quote, "Each year demonstrates more and more conclusively that the true pathology of mental disorders is to be sought in physical enfeeblement, that the disease is dependent on conditions of more or less exhaustion of the vital forces." So what were some of the diagnoses doctors at asylums made? A common cause at St. Elizabeth's for insanity was disease. 158 cases were caused by ill health. And it was believed that severe cases of disease could exhaust a victim's, a patient's body so much that it could literally drive them insane, could make them mentally ill. 82 cases were diagnosed as being caused by head wound. And these were mostly bullet wounds to the head. And they got remarkably pretty good at recognizing penetrating head injuries as causing mental illness or something like it. And that was kind of self-evident, a bullet wound to the head, and then changing behavior and emotions and actions. That seemed to be pretty causal. They weren't as good at diagnosing what we might call closed head injuries. So something like a traumatic brain injury that might be diagnosed today, they weren't as good diagnosing that back then for obvious reasons. They don't have MRI, they don't have the technology to look inside the brain, so they have to guess. A common diagnosis, and in fact the most common in the post-war period, was alcoholism. 187 cases were diagnosed as being caused by, quote, intemperance or alcoholism. And this comes under the classification of moral causes. Physical causes were disease, blows to the head, exposure. Moral causes were a violation of the moral code, which they believed could drive people insane. Alcoholism, lack of self-control, intemperance was believed to also be a cause of mental illness. Interestingly, the families of veterans in the post-war period, some of them, began to connect the mental illness of their loved ones with the war. One such case was John Harris, who was a really remarkable figure, an African-American physician during the war. And he eventually, sadly, had to enter St. Elizabeth's as a patient. And his wife later wrote the asylum superintendent, Dr. Godding, in 1883, quote, "I do not know that I ever told you that Dr. Harris went through the war and was on the field with the army when Richmond was taken. I've been asked, were not the seeds of insanity sown when he was on the field and saw the distress and suffering of our army? He never shrank from duty, and he was a faithful and efficient contract surgeon. Were not his nerves affected by what he saw and what he was obliged to go through with?" And many families began to make this connection because their loved ones had marched off strong and hale and hardy men and had returned kind of wrecks of their former selves. And that seemed kind of obvious. Later, there was probably a financial incentive, as by the 1880s and 1890s, pensions had been liberalized. It was much easier to get a post war pension. And so, probably some families were angling for a pension here, and perhaps Mrs. Harris was as well. We don't know for sure. And she mentioned nerves, and a big change of medicine coming out of the Civil War was nerves and nerve injuries. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell became interested in injuries of the nerves that he was seeing as a contract surgeon treating Civil War soldiers injured in the war. And he asked if a hospital could be open to exclusively study and treat these nerve injuries. And Turner's Lane Hospital was born, which was designed to exclusively study and treat injuries of the nerves, which mostly were gunshot wounds that shredded the nerves. Civil War projectiles are these 50 caliber soft lead projectiles that when they hit something, even something soft like a human body, they flatten and then they begin to tumble and they mangle flesh and shatter bones and shred nerves. And so many soldiers suffered with nerve injuries, which were often very painful and debilitating and confusing. And Mitchell argued and saw many patients which he viewed as having nerve injuries, but perhaps could have had something else, such as mental illness. There was a little bit of a gray area between some of Mitchell's patients and those at an asylum. One such patient noted in his book, Remote Consequences of Injuries of Nerves, read, quote, "The patient has frequent roaring in his head and black specks before the eyes. He has suffered much from an attack of nervous prostration. He was melancholic, had hallucinations, depressing forebodings, and horrible dreams. He had great improvement during some months in the infirmary." Mitchell later became more interested in social changes and perhaps their effect on mental health and mental illness. His book, Wear and Tear, argued that social and cultural changes of the Gilded Age had perhaps been driving the rise in what was then known as hysteria. He asked in that book, quote, "Have we lived too fast? The cruel competition for the dollar, the new and exacting habits of business, the telegraph and railway, brought about some great and growing evils. The wearing incessant cares of overwork, of business anxiety, produce directly diseases of the nervous system." And the discipline and study of nerves, neurology, was born. The American father of neurology was Mitchell, who got his start treating Civil War soldiers and went on to argue about possible nerve damages from social and cultural changes of the post-war period. And these two disciplines, insane asylum work and neurology, began to compete with each other for patients and with authoritative influence over what was causing mental illness. So much so that many asylum physicians began to sort of question their own practice. One such asylum physician at a conference began to question, whether this was actually a science that they were practicing, saying, quote, "Do we not know that a patient might be brought into this room at this moment, and if each member was asked to classify his disease, some would place him under the head of dementia and others under the head of chronic mania?" One doctor responded and said, "No, I think we would be pretty clear of classification. I think we would all agree." And this doctor responded and said, "No, I think there's a very great difference in the minds of superintendents of our various institutions in regard to classification. I believe there's nothing like uniformity in that respect." And the emergence of neurology had kind of shaken status, regular asylum doctors, superintendents in insane asylums, probably ultimately resulting in some of their decline. Okay. that's all I have for presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, that was fascinating. And thank you so much for giving us the overview of your book. Melissa, do we have any questions from the audience?
We don't right now. I want to actually let everybody know that if you drop questions in the comments, I can ask Dillon the questions here live. So if you have a question for him, please leave it in the comments and we'll try to get through some of those. We'll ask a few ourselves, I guess, right now.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with with one that I think a lot of people might want to know is how did you get the idea for the book? There's so many books written on the Civil War, and this topic, how did you get interested in it?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. Well, I graduated high school in 2001, and 9/11 happened several months later, and then the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq shortly thereafter. So, I spent college in the invasions of the wars in the Middle East, and there was a lot of publications and writings that I read about the rise in PTSD among soldiers fighting in those conflicts. And so that was kind of already on my mind going through college. And then in grad school, I read Shook Over Hell by Eric Dean, which compared Civil War soldiers and Vietnam soldiers and argued that Civil War soldiers had PTSD. And that kind of blew me away and got me interested in the topic. And then I went to the University of Georgia for grad school. Go Dogs! And the original project was looking at psychiatric casualties and physical injuries. So it was going to look at mental illness and amputation. Because I didn't think I could write a whole book on just mentally ill Civil War soldiers. But it was kind of turning into like Frankenstein's monster, like loosely stitched together. And so I had a long talk with my PhD advisor, Steve Barry, and kind of said, I'm thinking about just focusing on um, mentally ill Civil War soldiers. And he said, go for it. And that was that. Uh, so it was really, kind of growing up with these conflicts in college and then reading Shook Over Hell that really kind of got me super interested in looking at this and thinking about this topic. I will also say that, um, you know, my mother is a big history buff and history enthusiast, and so we're always thinking about and talking about history. But she didn't sugarcoat history. I mean, even our own family history, she was pretty honest about, which has some dark aspects to it. So I think I kind of, because of that upbringing, was kind of more attuned and interested in the darker aspects of history.
Interesting.
So,
What was
how did you go about finding sources? What did you use for sources? How do you go about finding out about PTSD and Civil War soldiers?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I spent a lot of time at the National Archives, which houses the records of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the insane asylum there. And it was a process of going through those records, finding good records, and then looking up a pension file if that patient had one. Um, and kind of just doing some cross reference that way. Um, and so it was a lot of work in asylum records, a lot of work in pension records, um, looking at a lot of letters and diaries. And that was really all of this actually was, reading other great works on this topic and tracking down some of their sources and using their sources. Because, historians are kind of gracious thieves. We leave little footnotes for readers to track down sources. So, yeah, it was just a lot of going through letters and diaries, asylum records, which are very dark, and looking at pension files.
We have a couple of questions actually coming in. There, and I know your book addresses this quite a bit too. There is a question about whether there was an increase in suicides of Civil War soldiers after the war, of course.
Yeah, I didn't look at suicides really because there's been a lot of great work on that already. David Silkenat wrote a book about suicide in North Carolina during and after the war, and he pretty conclusively shows that um, there was a pretty stark rise in suicides in the post-war period in North Carolina. Um, and so, yeah, there was a rise in suicides, especially, I think especially in the South, but not exclusively the South. The North had a rise in suicides, I believe, as well. But I didn't focus on that in the book because that's kind of ground that's been more well covered.
What about alcohol abuse and drug abuse? We have some people asking about that. Was there an increase in that, that's documented or that you could see as a trend in these soldiers as well as veterans?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know for sure because it's hard to measure that. It's not like, census officials were going around and saying, "How old are you? What's your occupation? How much booze do you drink?" And, what was its relation to last 10 years ago, So we don't quite know. My guess would be that, well, it's worth saying that Americans just drank a lot in the 19th century. I mean,
Yeah.
they were remarkable boozers. Um, so, that being said, it seems that a lot of Civil War veterans, certainly in asylums, had a drinking problem. Um, and asylum doctors, viewed that as a cause and not a symptom of mental illness. And that was because at the time, ideas of manhood were really closely tied up with self control. And if you couldn't control your impulses like drinking and be a moderate drinker, then there was, something quote unquote wrong with you. Um, so, I think anecdotally, it seems that there's a rise, certainly among Civil War soldiers and veterans, but I couldn't say conclusively. I don't think we have the records on that. Drug abuse seems to be pretty clear that there was a pretty stark rise in drug abuse. Jonathan Jones is working on, or maybe he's already published his book on.
Coming out later this year. We're going to have him actually at the museum talking about his book and have a book signing as well. Mhm.
Excellent. Yeah. So he writes about opium addiction and abuse among Civil War soldiers and veterans. And I think he's found pretty clearly that there's a demonstrable rise. David Courtwright has done work on opium abuse among Civil War soldiers and veterans as well, and also concluded that there was a pretty stark rise in opium abuse in the post-war period.
Yeah. Yeah, really fascinating.
Mhm.
So we also have a question about what this is kind of two-part, they kind of go together, but what did families do for these mentally ill soldiers? And also in the same line, was there therapy available for people who didn't go to mental institutions or that stayed home? Were there other therapies available to them?
Interesting questions.
Yeah.
So the ideal situation at the time was that mentally ill individuals would be cared for by their families. That's what everyone tried, and that's what probably many people did. And there's probably folks who were mentally ill who we don't have in the historical record because they just stayed with their families and their families treated them. So that's what everyone tried. That was considered the ideal situation. But if a family member became so mentally ill that they were unmanageable or violent, then they would be sent to an institution like an asylum um, that would treat them and medicate them and get them more controllable. So and it was the pension records, looking through some of these patients in the asylum are just really heartbreaking,
Yeah.
because, this is a strongly patriarchal society, where women don't have a lot of opportunities for wage work and wage earning. And so if a husband or father becomes mentally ill and ends up having to go to an asylum, that's the main breadwinner of the family, and it just punches a deadly hole into the family ship. And it reduces many of these families to pretty sad states of poverty. Um, a lot of them really angle for a pension, which is why we get a lot of these pension records, so they have
Yeah.
something to keep them afloat. And they're nice records for historians like me to try and reconstruct this as well. So families are in a really tough spot, many of them, unless they come from a well-to-do family. But even then, it's a really difficult experience. Um, as I said, families, many of them come to different conclusions than the doctors. Doctors don't draw a connection between the war and mental illness. They don't think that service in the war could drive soldiers or veterans mentally ill at the time. But many families are drawing that conclusion and saying, my husband marched off healthy and fine and he came home a wreck. How do you explain that?
Yeah.
The war drove him insane.
Yeah.
And so they're making more modern connections, I think, than doctors because, you know, it's self-evident to them. They see healthy husbands and fathers march off and then, really wrecked uh, on their return. Therapy. Um, so there's really not anything like we have today, like a therapist to go to. Um, but the book argues that probably many soldiers and veterans practice various forms of what we might call self therapy. So a chapter in the book looks at coping and how
Yeah.
Civil War soldiers coped with the trauma of war, and they turned to things like religion to help them make sense of the war, and make sense of the chaos and bloodshed of the war. They probably turned to kind of straggling or illegally leaving the lines to get a break from the conflict. They turned to humor. They turned to camaraderie. These were all, I argue, kind of self therapy or coping with the trauma of war. Um, and they probably, many of them, continued to do that, continued to, lean on religion, on friends and comrades, on humor. But they don't have like therapists as we think of them. That doesn't really exist at the time. The closest thing is going to an asylum. The asylum doctors are the closest thing to a therapist as we think of it today. And that's kind of considered a last resort. Um, there's a lot of feelings of stigma and shame at the time with mental illness because it was believed that mental illness was hereditary. So the kind of the sins of the father could be inherited by the son. And so people were loath at the time to go to an asylum because it kind of could put kind of a taint on the family tree.
Yeah.
That's kind of a long-winded response, but good question.
No, that is a good question and a great answer too. We have some questions coming in too, along the same lines of were there rises in domestic abuse and violence? You talk a little bit about some of those byproducts of the PTSD in your book too.
Yeah. Um, I think again, like alcohol, there's no way to measure that. We can't say for sure whether there's a rise in violence and domestic abuse. There's hints that there was. So there's a little bit of research that hints that there was a rise in violence, perhaps attributable in some way to Civil War veterans. Um, there was more, like I can't remember the exact details of this, but there was something like half of all inmates in New York State penitentiaries were Civil War veterans, some report concluded in like 1872. So there's little anecdotal hints that there's a rise in violence and a rise in domestic abuse, but we can't measure it. There's no way to conclusively show whether there was a rise or a decline or it was flat.
Yeah.
It seems to be sadly not uncommon that there's domestic abuse, and in fact, violence is often what got a mentally ill veteran committed. It was often an act of violence that then drove their family to be like, we can't do this anymore, and they would then transfer their loved one to an institution. And that's often kind of the precipitating event.
Interesting.
And but I think also kind of like alcoholism, um, violence is just shockingly common in the 19th century. It's a landscape of violence. So um, yeah, that's kind of worth
Yeah.
saying.
So you talk a little bit about this in your book too, and we have a question coming in about how the South treats patients as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how your book addresses there's a difference for veterans in the North and the South and how they are able to cope with the aftermath of war.
Yeah. So the North sets up a kind of national asylum. St. Elizabeth's in 1866, Congress says is designated to treat all mentally ill soldiers and veterans from the Civil War. So they have this national asylum for Civil War veterans. The South has nothing like that. There is no, and I should say, St. Elizabeth's doesn't treat Confederate veterans because they were, rebels.
Right.
There's no such thing in the South. There's no St. Elizabeth's of the South. There are Southern state asylums. So there's state asylums in the South, but they're not designed to treat Civil War soldiers or veterans. Civil War veterans end up there, many of them, and part of the book deals out looking at some of these asylums in the South. Um, Northern veterans also have pensions. So if you were injured in the conflict, you get a pension, but then it expands. And then by 1890, it's if you just serve 90 days, you could get a pension. Um, those don't apply to Confederate veterans. So Confederate veterans, because they were rebels, don't get a pension. Um, and so Confederate veterans are just seem much more on the fringes. They don't have the institutional support that Union veterans do. And so they're much more kind of, for lack of a better term, on their own, on the fringes. Some of them end up in state asylums. Um, there's the South is, America in the 19th century is a pretty violent place, but within that, the South is a very violent place. And so there's a lot of violence, some of it perpetrated by Civil War veterans, some Civil War veterans victims of that violence. Um, yeah, they are much more on their own on the fringes without any institutional support.
We have a question too about the asylum. When you say that they entered into the asylum, and like St. Elizabeth's, if you were checked into St. Elizabeth's, who paid for that? Was the family had to pay some of, fees for it, or was it fully funded by the government?
Yeah, good question. St.
Yeah.
Elizabeth is funded by the government for indigent patients,
Okay.
meaning patients who were basically too poor to pay, they would be subsidized by the federal government.
Interesting.
Um, then there were paying patients, so if you could afford it, you were supposed to pay. And there becomes a major problem. There becomes a major problem, which is in a lot of the St. Elizabeth's records in the National Archives, in a lot of files, there's a letter from the asylum superintendent who says, "Hey, we just found out this guy's getting a pension, and we're
Yeah.
paying for him. Like that should be going to for his treatment." So that becomes an issue, like how to figure out because pension payments should be going towards the treatment of the patient. but a lot of times the families are taking that pension money because they need to eat and they need to
Right.
survive. And very naturally, the breadwinner of the family is now in an asylum, and so they're trying to make ends meet, and so many of them are taking the pension money. And when the asylum
Interesting.
figures out they're not happy about it. Um, and then the state asylums were the same. Patients who couldn't pay would be treated at the expense of the state, and then paying patients were supposed to pay. And then there's private asylums, and private asylums are pay only. So, and these are more of like the concierge service asylum of the time, believed to be kind of better service, better amenities. It's the first class of insane asylums of the 19th century. Um, does that does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And sort of, the difference between North and South, and your book also addresses the difference between African American veterans and white veterans. And we have a question online about, how did African Americans or Blacks also receive treatment? Were there places for them to go? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about how there are, like your book says, they didn't suffer as many, as much from PTSD as white.
Yeah, so St. Elizabeth's from 1861 to 1890 treats 2,700 white Union Civil War soldiers and veterans. During the same period, they treat less than 50 Black Civil War soldiers and veterans. And so the number is way less. And one of the questions of the book is why? Why were so fewer African American soldiers and veterans patients at St. Elizabeth's? The answer is complex. Not nearly as many African Americans served as soldiers. 2 million Northern whites served by 1865. About 200,000 African Americans served by 1865. So just less African Americans are serving than whites. Those that serve, not many of them see combat. They're mostly used as kind of laborers and on garrison duty. That's not because they didn't want to, it's because white officers, because of racism, felt like Black soldiers wouldn't be able to stand up to combat. And then there's not many places to treat African American patients. St. Elizabeth's is one of the few. Um, by like 1880, see if I can remember this right. By 1880, between 1860 and 1884, there's like 27 insane asylums constructed throughout the United States. Not
Wow.
one was constructed to treat African American patients. And by 1885, there was only one. Central State Insane Asylum in Virginia was the single and only insane asylum to treat Black patients.
Wow.
Many of those asylums don't even take Black patients at all. St. Elizabeth's takes some, but many of them just refuse any service at all to Black patients. So, that number may be explained that they're just turned away by many
Yeah.
institutions. They don't treat them. And then those that treat Black patients, the doctors there were also pretty racist, for lack of a better term. A common diagnosis in the post-war period was that African Americans were driven insane by freedom, where they became mentally ill because of emancipation. And
Wow.
these were kind of Southern sympathizing doctors who said, like, slavery was better for African Americans. Look what's happening to them. And so you have to think that even if African Americans could be treated by an asylum doctor, would they want to, with doctors spouting such, racist tropes like that?
Right.
Uh, and then I guess finally, David Silkenat argues this in his book, and I piggybacked off it, which is there was a lot of pressure because of some of the racism among whites at the time to be successful with freedom. And so there may have been many African Americans who were suffering with mental illness who refused to seek treatment because they didn't want to be evidence of failure with freedom, likely. And then I said finally, but I guess finally, uh, uh, the experience for those who serve in the war, for some African American soldiers, not all, but for some, it's much less ambiguous. They're fighting for freedom. They're fighting to destroy slavery. It's a less ambiguous conflict, and it may have provoked, you know, less trauma,
Mhm.
because many of them kind of believe in the cause of destroying slavery and liberating their friends and family. Um, anyway, so
Yeah,
it's
I would say if we have a couple people asking that question, if you're interested, definitely to read the book. I think you really go into a lot of interesting details about how the war is a different experience for, Black soldiers, yes, than it is for white soldiers. And also even talking about whether they continue on after in the service after the war, how that can impact your experience after the war as well. Tracy, you want to ask one? I know you have some questions too, so we have a lot of questions coming in, but I'll let you.
Well, I don't want to step on anybody's toes. Preferably for our audience to ask, but I did have one quick one that because our museum also runs the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office. I was interested because you read a lot about in Clara Barton's diaries and things about the terrible nightmares she has, and uh, visions of the battles that she was tending to soldiers in, and cannon fire and everything else. And just wondering, that sounds kind of like PTSD to me. And I'm just wondering if you have in the course of your research for this book found any information about how the war affected nurses and other women who worked on the front lines.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I did actually. And I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of years ago after COVID, arguing that, we might see some rises in PTSD from nurses treating COVID patients, and kind of made the comparison with nurses during the Civil War. Um, and yeah, I found a number of instances of Civil War nurses writing about what we might call, nightmares or flashbacks. Um, Walt Whitman in his poem writes about kind of visions of a dead patient splayed out that keeps coming back to him. Whitman, of course, was a nurse during the Civil War.
Mhm.
Um, and Kate Cummings, a Southern nurse, writes about after the war when she's making the journey back to Mobile, and she keeps being hit with what she describes as visions of the hospital and patients and the conflict that kind of rise in review before her. She says, which kind of sounds like, a flashback of sorts, or something like that. So yeah, there's anecdotal little pieces here and there that nurses were kind of haunted in many ways, traumatized by their experience in the conflict as well.
Interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have lots of questions, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them because we are at the top of the hour here. So if we did not get to your questions, I apologize. If you will try to maybe address some of them in the comments later, but also if you want your questions answered, this is the book and it is available on in our online store as well. I'll be sure to drop that link in the comments as well. We have one question that I think is a great one to sort of wrap it up. What's your next project?
I don't have one. I'll be honest. I work at a community college, Butte College, and my teaching load is 5 classes a semester.
Oh,
So I'm
wow.
very busy, and I also have a 2-year-old.
Oh, well, there, enough said.
So time is not
No.
much of an option right now. Time's a luxury. So I'm just trying to keep my head above water with work and raising a tiny human. So
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
have
those
anything
are
in
noble efforts.
the hopper.
So,
Yeah, yeah, I don't have anything in the hopper right now. Maybe down the road when I get more time, uh, I'd like to maybe research and write more about Prince Rivers, who's this character in my book, an African American soldier who I became pretty fascinated with, and is a prominent character in the book. And I'd like to maybe in a while, in a few years, start maybe researching and writing about him. Um, but
Great.
nothing currently in the hopper, unfortunately.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Too busy.
Well,
Well,
Melissa, you have any last words here?
no, I mean, we obviously want to thank you very much for joining us, and everybody online as well for joining us. We're going to also put this, post this up on our YouTube page. And if you like this content and you're not a member of the museum, absolutely become a member of the museum, because we are going to have more Meet the Author events. Our next one is in May with Scott Hartwig. We'll be talking about his tome on Antietam, and we've got lots of great content this year coming up in multiple different platforms. That if you want to know about all of it, then definitely become a member. It supports the museum as well. So.
Absolutely. And if you're in the Frederick area, be sure to check out our first Saturday speaker series too.
Yes.
Melissa was just one of our first Saturday speakers, but we've got a whole bunch scheduled for the rest of the year.
Yes. Next month we'll have Leslie Gordon on, talking about her new book, Dread Danger.
All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you everybody again for tuning in, and thank you, Dillon, for taking the time to speak with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.